Chapter 31, titled Tradition and Traditionalism, distinguishes between the authentic traditional spirit and the modern phenomenon of traditionalism. It elaborates on how anti-traditional action through various forms of falsification and suggestion corrupts the very idea of tradition, thereby misleading those who seek to counteract the prevailing modern disorder. The chapter begins by identifying falsification, particularly of language, as a hallmark of the current era. Words are misused and diverted from their true meanings, losing their original qualitative significance and retaining only quantitative aspects. This linguistic distortion is described as a diversion, where words are applied inappropriately or even contradictorily to their normal sense, contributing to the intellectual confusion that reigns everywhere in the present world. Guénon suggests that this confusion is not accidental, but is willed by that which lies hidden behind the whole modern deviation. A prime example is the illegitimate use of the word tradition itself, with its meaning improperly assimilated to modern conceptions, often equating it with mere custom or usage, thereby bringing it down to a purely human level devoid of profound significance. Guénon posits that the modern mentality is a product of vast collective suggestion that has continuously operated for centuries, leading to the formation and development of the anti-traditional spirit. As the negative phase of modern deviation, characterized by the dominance of materialistic mentality, approaches its end, there is a risk of a reaction against the apparent disorder. This is where the falsification of the traditional idea becomes particularly effective, as the widespread ignorance of tradition leaves those aspiring to recover it vulnerable to accepting false ideas presented under its name. Those who, having a sort of tendency or aspiration toward tradition without really knowing anything at all about it, are termed traditionalists. They are mere seekers who, lacking the guiding principles of true knowledge, are susceptible to going astray. Despite declaring themselves anti-modern, they may still be subtly affected by attenuated modern ideas, which makes their efforts ineffective or even counterproductive. Their praiseworthy attempts to critique modern civilization often result in curiously disproportionate and insignificant remedies, lacking any profound knowledge. A crucial aspect of this subversion is the negation of the suprahuman element inherent in true tradition. Modern historians of religion, for instance, are eager to explain everything through exclusively human factors, whether psychological or social, thereby reducing tradition to a level it does not genuinely occupy. This aligns with the broader goal of maintaining the modern mentality's delusion and directing it toward the worst modalities of the infrahuman. Guénon also highlights how attempts to react against modern disorder can be strategically diverted toward earlier, less advanced stages of deviation, which are then misleadingly presented as order. This neutralizes potential opposition. Furthermore, engaging in the agitation and mutual collision of external movements, even if seemingly opposed to the modern spirit, implicitly supports the very influences driving the modern deviation. This taking sides constitutes an unwitting adoption of an anti-traditional attitude, as these movements often lack true principles despite their rhetoric. The result is a further increase in disorder and confusion, contributing to the ultimate dissolution. In essence, Chapter 31 reveals the insidious nature of anti-traditional action, which not only directly opposes tradition, but also subtly infiltrates and corrupts efforts to restore it. By falsifying core concepts like tradition, manufacturing artificial mentalities, and diverting well-intentioned traditionalists into ineffective or counterproductive paths, it systematically progresses the world towards a state of pure quantity and eventual dissolution. Chapter 32, titled Neo-Spiritualism, serves as a critical exposition of a new, insidious phase in the anti-traditional agenda, moving beyond the negative phase of outright materialism to a more subtle and perilous form of subversion. It describes how well-intentioned individuals seeking to counteract modern disorder are instead drawn into dangerous psychic delusions, ultimately becoming unconscious auxiliaries in the counter-initiation. Guénon posits that while materialism, with its stark negation of anything beyond the corporeal, offered a sort of limited security like a mollusk in its shell, this shell has now developed fissures from below. As the materialistic mentality begins to wane in scientific and philosophical theory, albeit persisting in common practice, a new landscape emerges where the dominant impression today is very different, for it has become an impression of instability extending to all domains. Neo-spiritualism capitalizes on this shift, stepping in to fill the void left by a decaying materialism, not by offering true spirituality, but by leading humanity further towards dissolution. The phenomenon of neo-spiritualism is characterized by a multitude of diverse forms, often marked by internal rivalry and even violent conflict, despite a superficial preaching of fraternity. Guénon identifies this internal discord as a truly chaotic phenomenon, indicative of an advanced stage on the road to dissolution. Paradoxically, while appearing to oppose materialism, neo-spiritualism closely resembles it, functioning as a transposed materialism. This means it extends materialistic concepts beyond the limits of the corporeal world, portraying the subtle world, which it mistakenly calls spiritual, through crude representations, almost entirely of images borrowed from the corporeal domain. Furthermore, neo-spiritualism is deeply embedded in the scientistic, progressivist, and evolutionary ideas characteristic of the modern mentality. Even those schools attempting an archaism by adopting fragments of traditional ideas or vocabulary invariably adapt them to constantly changing theories of modern science, often relying on works of popularization. This inherent modernism stands in stark contradiction to any genuine traditional outlook, highlighting the depth of its falsification. A central danger of neo-spiritualism lies in its pseudo-realization and promotion of inverted spirituality. It fosters a lure of the phenomenon, encouraging the pursuit of sensational results, which are then mistakenly equated with spiritual realization. Guénon emphatically states that phenomena by themselves prove absolutely nothing where the truth of a doctrine or of any sort of teaching is concerned, as they are the special domain of the great illusion and can be simulated by inferior forces. This focus on external manifestations completely bypasses genuine spiritual development, leading individuals astray into psychic delusions far more perilous than the commonplace and mediocre security of ordinary life offered by materialism. In the grand scheme of anti-traditional action, neo-spiritualism plays a crucial role in the second phase, where the objective shifts from merely negating tradition to actively subverting it. Materialism, having given efficient service in denying to man access to possibilities of a superior order, lacked the power to unchain the inferior forces that alone can bring to finality the work of disorder and dissolution. Neo-spiritualism, through its opening of the shell of modern thought, effectively unleashes these dissolving and destructive forces of the inferior, subtle domain into the world. It is a product of the state of disorder and confusion brought about by the satanic activity that has its conscious starting point in the counter-initiation. Its pseudo-initiatic manifestations are a dangerous form of counterfeit, attacking tradition from within by perverting its very spirit. In summary, Chapter 32 reveals neo-spiritualism as a complex and highly dangerous development in the modern deviation. Far from being a genuine spiritual revival, it is a distorted reflection of materialism masquerading as spirituality while actively facilitating the unleashing of inferior psychic influences. Its internal contradictions, superficiality, and reliance on phenomenalism contribute to a chaotic environment that accelerates the world's descent toward final dissolution, serving as a key instrument for the counter-initiation in its ultimate goal of inverted spirituality. Chapter 33, Contemporary Intuitionism, critically examines modern philosophical and psychological tendencies, particularly those associated with figures like William James and Henry Bergson. Guénon argues that these movements, while seemingly reacting against materialism, ultimately represent a dangerous progression in anti-traditional action, leading individuals deeper into psychic delusions rather than true spiritual understanding. The chapter positions these trends within the second phase of anti-traditional action, which aims not merely to negate tradition, but to actively subvert it. While Bergson is acknowledged for his justifiable criticisms of rationalism and its consequences, Guénon points out that his solutions lead in the wrong direction. Instead of seeking above reason for true intellectual intuition, Bergson, like William James, delves beneath it, advocating for an imagined intuition of an exclusively sensitive and vital order. This approach blends sensory intuition with obscure forces of instinct and sentiment, ultimately leading, undoubtedly, toward the infrahuman. This sub-rational inclination gives Bergson's intuitionism manifest affinities with neo-spiritualism, as both are expressions of similar underlying tendencies. A defining characteristic of this contemporary intuitionism is its radical evolutionism, which asserts that all reality exists exclusively within becoming, thereby formally denying all immutable principle and consequently of all metaphysics. This emphasis on constant change, in contrast to the solidification associated with rationalism and materialism, is seen by Guénon as a prefiguration of the dissolution of all things in the final chaos. Guénon further scrutinizes Bergson's views on religion, particularly as presented in works like The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. Bergson, consistent with modern theories, seeks to reduce religion to a purely human level, effectively denying its essence. He categorizes religion into static, social or closed religion, and dynamic, psychological or open religion types. Naturally, from his philosophy of becoming, Bergson prefers dynamic religion, which he considers superior, dismissing static religion, which Guénon identifies with true religion as mere imaginary storytelling. Guénon concludes that Bergson's dynamic religion is, in reality, not religion at all, and his understanding of mysticism, which he praises for its individual, vague, inconsistent, anarchic qualities, further demonstrates his misinterpretation as he neglects its traditional foundations. In a particularly critical passage, Guénon highlights Bergson's uncritical acceptance of the sociological school's tales regarding the origins of static religion, including concepts like magic, totemism, and primitive mentality. Bergson even invents a fable-making function to deny any real foundation for what he considers superstitions. Guénon finds it remarkable that Bergson, from his private room, would assert that if primitive intelligence had begun its dealings with such matters by conceiving principles, it would soon have had to give way to experience, which would have demonstrated their falsity. Guénon views this as a profound oversight, demonstrating a philosopher's inability to comprehend realities beyond his preconceived modern scientific framework. Ironically, Guénon notes that magic, through the recent fissures in our world, has begun to cruelly avenge Bergson's denials, reappearing in its lowest and most rudimentary form as psychic science or metapsychics. This psychic science is destined to play a significant role in Bergson's dynamic religion. Bergson's acceptance of spiritualist theories, such as the possibility and even the probability of a survival of the soul, which he equates with the phantasmagoria of psychic corpses from spiritualist seances, is presented as a profound delusion. Guénon concludes that Bergson, like William James before him, became a dupe, serving as an unconscious intermediary for the hoaxing of many others by accepting these new philosophy superstitions. In essence, Chapter 33 portrays contemporary intuitionism as a deceptively harmful trend. By redirecting intellectual inquiry beneath reason and embracing evolutionary, anti-metaphysical and phenomenalistic views of religion and reality, it actively contributes to the world's dissolution. It acts as a facilitator for the counter-initiation by subtly drawing well-meaning individuals into dangerous psychic delusions and inverted spirituality, even while they believe they are fighting materialism. Chapter 34, titled The Misdeeds of Psychoanalysis, critically examines modern psychological theories, particularly psychoanalysis, as a dangerous manifestation of the anti-traditional agenda's second phase. Guénon argues that these methods, unlike mere theoretical postulates, have disturbing practical applications that actively contribute to the world's increasing disequilibrium and movement toward final dissolution. Guénon notes a peculiar inconsistency in many psychologists who, despite dealing with subtle elements, maintain a materialistic attitude, reflecting their training and ignorance of these elements' true nature. A key focus of modern psychology, including psychoanalysis, is the subconscious rather than the superconscious. Guénon interprets this as an extension solely in a downward direction toward the most inferior psychic elements of the human being. This descent corresponds to the fissures through which malefic influences of the subtle world, described as infernal, penetrate the cosmic environment. He criticizes the notion that lower states are more profound, arguing that this tendency runs counter to genuine spirituality, which alone reaches the principle and the very center of the being. Any encounter psychology has with the superconscious is an attempt to annex it by assimilating it to the subconscious, a process he identifies as a real subversion. Furthermore, psychoanalysis, like the new philosophy, tends to converge with metapsychics and implicitly with spiritualism, drawing on the same obscure elements of a debased psychism. Guénon views psychology's role in this context as an active participant in the second phase of anti-traditional action, particularly when it forcibly assimilates things beyond its natural scope to the subconscious. A satanic character is revealed most clearly in the psychoanalytic interpretations of symbolism. Guénon distinguishes true symbolism, expressing suprahuman inspiration, from ordinary dreams, which are not truly symbolic. He asserts that while earlier psychological explanations of symbolism failed to recognize its essential, traditional order, psychoanalysts go further, dealing with things that are not merely human, but largely infrahuman. This constitutes not just a debasement, but a complete subversion, which, even if arising from incomprehension, is inherently satanic in the true sense of the word. The ignoble and repulsive character of these interpretations serves as a reliable mark of this. The therapeutic use of psychoanalysis is deemed extremely dangerous for both practitioners and patients, seen as a means to exacerbate the modern world's disequilibrium and hasten its final dissolution. Guénon refutes any supposed analogy between psychoanalysis and the initiatic descent into hell. He clarifies that the latter involves exhausting inferior possibilities to rise to superior states, whereas psychoanalysis leads to a fall into the mire, where inferior possibilities take possession and submerge the individual. This profane parody is a form of counterfeit. Guénon extends his critique to psychoanalytic attempts to interpret traditional doctrines like yoga. He denounces the assimilation of spiritual realization methods to psychoanalytic therapy as worse than cruder misinterpretations, e.g., yoga, as physical culture, precisely because its subtlety makes it more insidious. True yoga, he stresses, is for the perfectly balanced, aimed at spiritual development, not as a treatment for the ill. Perhaps most noteworthy is Guénon's examination of the psychoanalytic transmission, where aspiring practitioners must themselves be psychoanalyzed. He sees this as an evident imitation of the initiatic transmission, leaving an ineradicable imprint, but in an opposite sense, fostering an inferior psychism rather than spiritual development. He questions the origin of the powers transmitted by the first psychoanalysts, highlighting this psychic transmission's truly sinister mark and its terrifying likeness to certain sacraments of the devil. In essence, Guénon presents psychoanalysis as a deeply problematic force that, by focusing on the infrahuman and engaging in subversive interpretations of sacred concepts, actively facilitates the counter-initiation and the dissolution of human potential, leading individuals away from genuine spirituality into dangerous psychic chaos. Chapter 35. The confusion of the psychic and the spiritual highlights a widespread and dangerous misconception in the modern world: the failure to distinguish between the psychic and spiritual domains. Guénon argues that this confusion is not merely an intellectual error, but a profound problem with serious consequences, especially under current conditions. The root of this confusion, according to Guénon, lies in the long-standing Western inability to differentiate soul from spirit, a tendency greatly influenced by Cartesian dualism, which merged all non-corporeal elements into one vague category. This is evident in everyday language, where terms like spirits are popularly used for psychic entities that are far from spiritual, and even the term spiritualism itself is derived from this mistaken usage. Guénon asserts that propagating this confusion, whether intentionally or not, is setting beings on the road to getting lost in the infrahuman, thereby unconsciously serving the satanic forces of the counter-initiation. He clarifies that while a development of psychic possibilities is not inherently malefic, the psychic domain is fundamentally one of illusions. Its value depends entirely on whether it is seen as an end in itself or as a means to a higher spiritual goal. The most significant danger arises when individuals mistake psychic phenomena for spiritual realization. The lure of the phenomenon, the modern experimental tendency to seek sensational results, leads people to conflate these outcomes with genuine spiritual attainment. This approach, however, completely misses the spiritual order and can make individuals incapable of breaking free from these psychic attachments, leading to an inverted development or ultimately total disintegration in infrahuman states. Guénon warns against all appeals to the subconscious, instinct, subrational intuition, and vague vital forces promoted by modern philosophy and psychology. These tendencies, he argues, lead directly to contact with inferior states and result in a confusion or dissolution within a cosmic consciousness that rejects all transcendence and thus all true spirituality. He links this directly to anti-metaphysical errors like pantheism, immanentism, and naturalism, concluding that these literally amount to an inversion of spirituality, or Satanism. Using the symbolism of navigation across an ocean, representing the psychic domain, Guénon contrasts the initiatic journey, which seeks to cross safely to a goal, with those who fling themselves into the ocean and have no aspiration but to drown themselves in it. This fusion with a cosmic consciousness is in reality a descent into the ocean below, a confused and indistinct assemblage of all the psychic influences that have nothing to do with true spiritual influences. He notes that in this domain, counterfeit operates in its fullness, meaning that psychic phenomena can perfectly simulate spiritual ones, making it crucial not to attach importance to the phenomenal or to regard it as an unfavorable sign. This realm of death and of a dissolution without hope of return stands in stark contrast to the fullness of life that genuine spirituality offers. Chapter 36. Pseudo-initiation distinguishes pseudo-initiation as a dangerous counterfeit of true initiation, a product of the modern world's disorder and confusion driven by satanic, anti-traditional activity. Guénon carefully differentiates pseudo-initiation from counter-initiation, emphasizing that the latter is a very real, albeit inverted force, whereas pseudo-initiation itself is merely a parody, devoid of all profound reality, and its intrinsic value is quite simply nil. Despite its inherent emptiness, pseudo-initiation is far from harmless. Guénon argues that it is dangerous precisely because it attempts to imitate genuine rites, and such imitations, by their very nature, can never be imitated with impunity. It represents the most perilous form of pseudo-traditional counterfeiting, translating vague concepts into effective action and attacking tradition from within, targeting its esoteric and initiatic core. Pseudo-initiatic movements are often linked to neo-spiritualism and tend to display characteristic features of the modern spirit. These organizations, despite often preaching fraternity, are constantly engaged in rivalry and conflict, a chaotic phenomenon indicating their advanced stage on the path to dissolution. They are marked by evolutionism and progressivist ideas, even when they superficially adopt traditional terminology or an archaism. This leads to the perversion of authentic traditional elements, twisting their true meaning to align with anti-traditional directing ideas. A key characteristic of pseudo-initiation is its lack of spirit. Unlike genuine initiation, which represents the spirit, principal animator of all things, pseudo-initiation operates without it. This results in an action that is purely mechanical rather than truly organic, resembling the automatism of machines or psychic corpses. Guénon connects this to the broader theme of modern man becoming increasingly machine-like, deprived of spirituality. The unconsciousness of many pseudo-initiates is a significant factor. They may be unaware of the true purpose their activities serve, often victims of suggestions themselves, which they then propagate to others. This unconsciousness, however, does not diminish the danger or alter the subversive results which ultimately serve the counter-initiation's aims. Leaders of such organizations may resort to conscious trickery and charlatanism, often by reversing the true origins of traditional elements they borrow, claiming their own tradition as the common source. They prioritize quantity of adherents over the quality of disciples, further demonstrating their distance from genuine esotericism. Guénon offers examples of pseudo-initiatic movements, such as the sham Oriental tradition of theosophists, which misuses Oriental terminology, and French occultists who created a similar Western tradition. He also points to organizations calling themselves Rosicrucian, noting their mutual contradictions and claims to a tradition that has become obscure. These movements illustrate the syncretism and fantastic reconstitution of lost or forgotten traditions, relying on fragmentary or imagined elements. In essence, pseudo-initiation is depicted as a sophisticated and pervasive form of deception within the modern world, not merely a harmless pastime. By counterfeiting initiation and perverting traditional concepts, it actively contributes to the spread of anti-traditional ideas and serves as an instrument for the counter-initiation to attack genuine spirituality from within, ultimately leading to greater disorder and profanation. Guénon warns that its danger lies in its ability to inextricably mix truth and falsehood, making it a most deadly lie that presses the true into service in order to promote the triumph of the false. Chapter 37. The deceptiveness of prophecies serves as a critical examination of the various forms of predictions prevalent in the modern world, distinguishing them from true, spiritually inspired prophecies and highlighting their role in the ongoing anti-traditional subversion. Guénon begins by clarifying the terminology, reserving the word prophecy for announcements of future events found in sacred texts, originating from a purely spiritual order. All other foretellings, he states, are more accurately termed predictions. These predictions can stem from diverse sources. Some might be valid applications of secondary traditional sciences, if their often obscure meaning is correctly understood, while others arise from the confused perceptions of seers who unconsciously blend their experiences with their own ideas, leading to still greater confusion. Under current conditions, such predictions serve a specific, often insidious, purpose. They almost invariably present events in a distressing or terrifying light, which, when widely disseminated, disturbs the public mentality. Whether these predictions agree or contradict one another, they contribute to disorder, thereby benefiting the forces of subversion. Furthermore, originating from lower regions of the psychic domain, these predictions carry unbalancing and dissolving influences, causing discomfort or even serious, sometimes irremediable, psychological unbalance in individuals. Guénon cites the example of numerous predictions related to the Great Pope or Grand Monarch, which, though containing faint traces of truth, are distorted by inferior psychism, materialized and localized by the seer's preconceived notions. Such phenomena often arise from suggestions and touch upon very dark and underground matters. The inherent obscurity of many predictions, particularly those loosely based on traditional knowledge or biblical prophecies, is actively exploited for tendentious interpretations. Even well-intentioned interpreters can become victims and propagators of suggestion. Guénon describes this as a highly contagious psychic epidemic, which, far from being spontaneous, fits neatly into a conscious plan of subversion. He also warns against the growing diffusion of certain divinatory arts, which, as uncomprehended residues of lost traditional sciences, dangerously open the door to dubious psychic influences under the guise of intuition. A prominent example discussed is the prophecies of the Great Pyramid, which gained widespread dissemination, particularly in England, for purposes that Guénon suggests might be political, but certainly extend beyond ordinary politics. These prophecies were linked to efforts to persuade the English of their descent from the lost tribes of Israel. They involved arbitrary measurements of the pyramid's internal structures, with numerical correspondences then being assigned to historical dates. Guénon points out the manifest absurdity of this, given that the prophecies are presented from a Judeo-Christian perspective, suggesting the pyramid is not Egyptian but a Judeo-Christian monument. This relies on a highly contestable biblical chronology and a narrow Protestant literalism. The inclusion of seemingly anachronistic events, like the invention of railways, further highlights the grotesque element that Guénon attributes to the devil as a mark of falsity. He also notes the fantasy surrounding the pyramid's unfinished summit and the recurring number 13, reinforcing the contrived Judeo-Christian interpretation. Beyond merely disturbing the public, these predictions are used as instruments of direct suggestion. The repeated announcement of specific dates for the entry of humanity into a new era or the coming of a spiritual renewal contributes to the effective determination of the course of certain future events. Guénon illustrates this with the example of announcing a revolution which can help bring it about. This reflects a deliberate effort to create a state of mind favorable to specific outcomes within the plan of those manipulating these influences. In conclusion, Guénon warns that this pseudo-spiritual enterprise makes the outlook for the near future anything but reassuring. The chapter reveals how the modern world's fascination with the sensational, coupled with a lack of true spiritual discernment, makes it particularly vulnerable to manipulation by forces that, though often unconscious to their human instruments, are consciously working towards the final dissolution of the present world. Chapter 38. From Anti-Tradition to Counter-Tradition outlines a critical distinction in the forces working against genuine tradition in the modern world. Guénon differentiates anti-tradition as pure negation from counter-tradition as a more active and insidious force, presenting them as successive phases in a comprehensive plan of subversion. Anti-tradition is characterized as a force of pure negation. It found its most complete expression in integral materialism, prevalent towards the end of the 19th century. While effective in denying man access to superior possibilities, materialism, being purely negative, lacked the power to unleash the inferior forces necessary for the final work of disorder and dissolution. The reign of quantity, discussed in earlier chapters, also represents the endpoint of anti-tradition. The shift from anti-tradition to counter-tradition marks a new, more advanced phase of anti-traditional action, characterized by a move from mere negation to active subversion and counterfeiting. The counter-tradition aims at establishing inverted spirituality, which is a parody of true spirituality, imitating it in an inverse sense. This phase involves a pseudo-spiritual enterprise that, unlike the earlier materialistic phase, entails a reintroduction of quality into all things, but this quality is inverted with respect to its normal and legitimate significance. At the heart of counter-tradition is the counter-initiation, which is not an illusory counterfeit, but a very real force in its own order, effective in its action. While it necessarily imitates initiation like an inverted shadow, its true intention is not to imitate but to oppose, though it is metaphysically doomed to failure as the spiritual domain is inherently beyond its reach. The counter-initiation sphere of influence is primarily the psychic domain, where Satan, understood metaphysically as the spirit of negation and subversion, not a personification, operates. Guénon emphasizes that the counter-tradition, despite its imitative nature, will never be more than a parody, albeit an extreme and gigantic one. This parody is distinct from mere pseudo-initiation, which is described as having intrinsic value, quite simply nil. Pseudo-initiation and neo-spiritualism are seen as prefigurations of what the counter-tradition will fully manifest. Examples include the intentional inversion of legitimate symbols and the perversion of authentically traditional elements, twisting their meaning to serve anti-traditional ends. The possibility of such a profound subversion stems from the unique context of the modern world. The counter-initiation is not merely a human invention, but proceeds from the same unique source as all true initiation, albeit through a degeneration pushed to its extreme limit, resulting in an inversion that constitutes Satanism, properly so called. The representatives of counter-initiation, though profoundly ignorant of spiritual truth, are capable of leading beings toward the infrahuman realm. They are depicted as conscious agents of deceit, disseminating ideas like progress and evolutionism, which they themselves do not believe in, to manipulate the general mentality. However, Guénon notes that this apparent triumph of the counter-tradition is only a passing one. Traditional prophecies indicate that it will be destroyed by the direct intervention of spiritual influences when it seems most complete, preparing for the final rectification. This rectification will suddenly restore all things to their normal place, leading to the golden age of the future cycle. A crucial point is Guénon's caution against the Manichaean error of equating counter-tradition with an equally powerful and opposite principle to true tradition. He stresses that while the counter-tradition attempts opposition and imitation, no true symmetry or equivalence is possible, as supreme unity is beyond all oppositions. The stupidity of the devil lies in this very delusion, as even the counter-initiates are ultimately, though unconsciously subordinated to the divine will, fulfilling a necessary function within the total order. In essence, Chapter 38 highlights that the present period is a transitional one, moving beyond the static negativity of materialism towards a dynamic, active, and inverted form of anti-traditional action spearheaded by the counter-initiation, which systematically counterfeits and subverts all that is truly spiritual and traditional. Chapter 39. The Great Parody, or Spirituality Inverted, describes the culmination of anti-traditional forces in the form of an inverted spirituality and the reign of Antichrist. Guénon presents this as the ultimate stage in the plan of subversion, moving beyond mere negation to an active, parodic imitation of true tradition and spirituality. Guénon begins by clarifying that this inverted spirituality is a parody, imitating true spirituality in an inverse sense. He stresses that despite its pretensions, no true symmetry or equivalence is possible between this inverted spirituality and genuine spirituality, as the latter is essentially beyond all opposition. He warns against the Manichaean error, a prevalent misconception that wrongly places Satan on the same level as God, thereby denying the supreme unity that transcends all antagonisms. This dualist error is characteristic of those whose horizon does not extend beyond the manifested world, leading them to deny supreme unity. The reign of Antichrist is identified as the period when this counter-tradition reaches its zenith. The Antichrist, whether conceived as an individual or a collectivity, is the figure who will concentrate and synthesize all the powers of the counter-initiation for this final task. This being will be the exteriorization of the counter-initiatic organization, acting as the most complete expression and even incarnation of the malefic influences he gathers and projects onto the world. This period will no longer be the reign of quantity, which marked the end of mere anti-tradition. Instead, it will be characterized by a false spiritual restoration and a reintroduction of quality inverted with respect to its normal and legitimate significance. Following the egalitarianism of modern times, there will be a visibly established but inverted hierarchy with the Antichrist at its summit, nearer than any other being to the very bottom of the pit of hell. Even money, or its equivalent, will once again possess an inverted qualitative character, as indicated by prophecies about needing the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name to buy or sell. The Antichrist is described as less an individual than a symbol, a synthesis of all inverted symbolism and an incarnation of falsity itself. To achieve this extreme falsity, he will even adopt the very symbols of the Messiah but use them in an inverted sense. His characteristic mark will be the predominance or substitution of the malefic aspect for the benefic aspect through the subversion of symbols' double meanings. Descriptions of the Antichrist often emphasize bodily asymmetries and deformities, which Guénon interprets as visible signs of interior disequilibrium and disqualifications from an initiatic perspective, serving as qualifications for the counter-initiation. This deformity reflects the counter-tradition's nature as a caricature of true tradition. The counter-tradition, despite its other characteristics, will retain the mechanical character of modern world productions. It will be comparable to the automatism of psychic corpses, constituted of residues, animated artificially and momentarily, signifying its inherent lack of durability and its proximity to dissolution. Guénon emphasizes that this apparent triumph of the counter-tradition will be only a passing one. Traditional prophecies, when understood correctly, indicate that at the moment it seems most complete, it will be destroyed by the direct intervention of spiritual influences, leading to the final rectification and the preparation for the golden age of the future cycle. This rectification will suddenly restore all things to their normal place, representing a reversal of the state of subversion that immediately preceded it. The Great Parody is thus a transient and unstable reign, a penultimate stage before the end of the current Manvantara. Chapter 40, The End of a World, serves as a culmination of the preceding analyses, explaining the true nature of the signs of the times and the ultimate destiny of the current cosmic cycle. Guénon elucidates that the end of a world is not an absolute termination, but rather the end of a specific cycle or manvantara, a concept often misunderstood by those limited by a narrow perspective. This misunderstanding can lead to excessive and unjustified terrors in individuals not sufficiently detached from terrestrial existence. Guénon clarifies that while there can be many ends of the world corresponding to various cycles within cycles, the current end is of considerable importance, as it marks the conclusion of a whole manvantara and the temporal existence of a humanity. However, this does not imply the annihilation of the terrestrial world itself, as a rectification will occur at the final instant, leading to the reconstitution of the world for a new cycle. This rectification is the precise moment when all things are no less suddenly re-established in their primordial state. A key point of the chapter is to address the modern misconception of the Golden Age. Contrary to the idea, often espoused by partisans of progress, that the Golden Age lies solely in the future, Guénon asserts that for our current Manvantara, it is in the past, representing the primordial state. The notion of a future Golden Age, as it is presented by modernists and pseudo-traditions, refers to the Golden Age of another Manvantara, an insuperable obstacle for the profane mind. This false vision of a future Golden Age is intimately linked to the Antichrist's reign, which will attempt to bring it into being through the counter-tradition, providing a deceitful and ephemeral appearance of authenticity by counterfeiting the traditional idea of the sanctum regnum. This explains the preponderant role of evolutionist conceptions in these pseudo-traditions, which unconsciously contribute to the preparations for the Antichrist's arrival. The chapter also delves into the consciousness of the agents of the counter-initiation. These figures, who most fully represent the counter-initiation, cannot penetrate the spiritual world, and thus their knowledge of the intermediary world is irremediably falsified by the absence of the spirit. They are not genuine materialists or progressives, but rather practice conscious deceit when promulgating such ideas, using them as a means to an end. Their fundamental error is a profound and invincible ignorance of the true nature of all spirituality. This stems from a dualist error that perceives duality in everything without being able to resolve it by referring to a superior principle, thus denying supreme unity. Consequently, the Antichrist himself is presented as the most deluded of all beings, and the agents of the counter-initiation are ultimately dupes of the part they themselves are playing. Their delusion, though the worst delusion of all, serves a necessary function in the divine plan for the world's cycle of manifestation. Guénon concludes by discussing the twofold, benefic and malefic aspect of the world's history as a cyclic manifestation. The descent or degradation of the cycle, when viewed in isolation, appears malefic. However, when placed within the greater universal existence, this development, including the dark ages, inferior possibilities, serves a benefic purpose by making possible the integration of results that will become the principle of a new cycle. The catastrophic end, from a partial view, is simultaneously a rectification that re-establishes things in their primordial state. Ultimately, the malefic aspect represents only what is unstable and transitory, while the benefic aspect is permanent and positive. When viewed from the most profound order of reality, the end of a world is fundamentally the end of an illusion,